May the Lord be with you. This is Pastor Ryan over here at St. Peter's, and this is one of our confirmation catch-up videos. I've been calling them Cliff's Notes confirmation, but I should throw out a disclaimer that it is in no way associated with the Cliff's Notes trademark series. Maybe I should call it Crash Course confirmation or something. Regardless, the purpose of this series is for those students who are unable to join us for our regularly scheduled confirmation classes and discussions, which are on the first and third Sundays of each month, or maybe folks just don't feel safe gathering in person in this time of COVID. That's what these videos are for. If you can't be with us in person in class, this at least is intended that folks don't fall too far behind. It can't replace an hour of fellowship and conversation and questions, but it can keep us all on the same page, right? Now then, I believe we are on lessons 25 and 26 out of 30 or 31, so we're coming toward the end of our academic year. I've had a good time going through the Old Testament or First Testament with you, but we're not quite done yet. So just as a matter of review, the last time we had class, we talked about the great prophets of exile, and eventually, of course, the return of the Israelite people, the Judean people, from exile back to the Promised Land. Those prophets of exile, I emphasize the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and taken together, these prophets really bring a lot of new things to the people's understanding of God, to the Judean religion, the Israelite faith. And in part, this is a necessity because everything that had been associated with the Old Covenant, the First Covenant, had been lost in the exile. The temple was destroyed. The kingship was effectively ended. They could no longer live by the laws of the Torah as the laws of the land. And so in an alien land, people had to ask themselves, are we even still the people of God, the people of Yahweh? And the prophets of exile, their response was a resounding yes, right? Ezekiel had an amazing vision of God's throne in heaven being mobile, and in fact coming into exile along with the people. Jeremiah said that there is a new covenant coming that won't be like the old one that failed. This one will be written on people's hearts and will proclaim the forgiveness of sins. Isaiah said that a suffering servant would come who would suffer unjustly, yet be rewarded after death, and would somehow reconcile the many with God, that his unjust suffering would bring about mercy and grace for all of the people. And then, of course, you have Daniel, which is a wonderfully sort of rip-roaring book with many different episodes, all of which boil down to, well, I shouldn't say all of them, but for our purposes, the thing I wanted to focus on was the prophecy of a series of occupying empires culminating in a rock from heaven that would topple the fourth great occupying empire and hand it over to the saints. And for Christianity, this was seen as eventually a prophecy of Rome, of Christ, and of course of Peter, Petrus, the rock, who converted Rome to the faith of Christ, handed the empire over to the saints. And Daniel also started a countdown, or at least his interpreters did, so that people were looking forward to the coming of the Messiah, the Christ, who would not be like the messiahs of old, the kings and the prophets and the priests of old who failed, but this would be, in Daniel's words, one like unto a son of man, but who would in fact be so much more, who would be from heaven, whom Daniel described really as a second God, or a younger version of God, clearly divine, descending from heaven to earth. And so as the people are in exile and then returning from exile, they have these great expectations of a restoration of God's kingdom, of a cosmic Messiah, a Christ who would set the world right, and eventually of a general resurrection when God, through his Christ, would conquer even death and hell. It should be pointed out that a lot of these ideas were shared in common with the Zoroastrian religion of the Persians, under whom the peoples lived after Cyrus the Great, the emperor of the Medes and the Persians, conquered Babylon, ended the exile, let the people return. Judaism and Zoroastrianism very clearly influenced one another. To what degree and what direction is debatable, but I think it is fair to say that a Christian in good conscience could point to Zoroaster as an important prophet in the history of Revelation. And this is, of course, part of what Matthew is nodding at in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, with the arrival of the Magi, the gifts of the Magi, the three kings at the birth of Christ. The Persians, the Zoroastrians, are there at the first Christmas, because they too were looking for the Savior. Okay, all of that is review. Remember also what I called the ABCs. These are the empires that Judea, Israel had to deal with. A is for Assyrians. They conquered the north and made them the lost tribes of Israel. B is for Babylonians, technically the Neo-Babylonian Empire of the Chaldeans. They conquered the south and took them into exile. And C is for, as I said, Cyrus the Great, emperor of the Persians and Medes, who ended the exile and let the people go home. But some people weren't in a hurry to go home. They'd spent 70 years in Babylon, and they had it pretty good under Persia, and they had families, they had lives. The prophets, Jeremiah especially, had told them to settle where you are and pray for that place. Don't be bitter about the empire. Bring good wheresoever you may go. And many did not see a reason to go back to the promised land that had such terrible associations with it at this point in their history. Okay, so our first lesson today covers the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah, if that wasn't clear. When the people returned to Israel and were allowed to rebuild the temple, the three leaders of that first wave of returning exiles were Haggai, Zerubbabel, and Jeshua. Haggai was the prophet. Zerubbabel was the governor, but he was of royal blood of the house of David. So he, as a Persian governor, was fulfilling sort of the role of the old Davidic kings. He was royal. And then Jeshua was the high priest. So we had at least an attempt of restoring the old Israelite government that had basically three branches, just as our government does. Their three branches were prophet, priest, and king. Now, who are Ezra and Nehemiah? Well, keep in mind, as I said, not everybody returned at once. No, not everybody was in a rush to end the exile. It's kind of like that old cartoon with Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, where he finally catches the Roadrunner and he holds up a sign to the audience and says, "All right, wise guys, you wanted me to catch him. Now what do I do with him?" Right? There's a lot of people who wanted the exile to end, and when it did, weren't in any rush to go home. Ezra was a priest and scribe of Jewish Israelite descent, who ended up being the leader of a third wave of returnees from exile under the Emperor Artaxerxes, who ruled Persia from 464 to 423 BC. Nehemiah was not a priest and scribe, but he was the Jewish cupbearer of a later emperor, Artaxerxes II, from 404 to 358 BC. The cupbearer was a very prestigious and honorable position, because if you're bearing the cup of the emperor, that means he trusts you implicitly not to poison him, right? So Nehemiah is about as high up in the hierarchy of the Persian Empire as anyone who isn't the emperor could dream of going. And Nehemiah would lead a fourth wave of returnees. The goal here is to rebuild, to restore the Holy Land, the Temple, Jerusalem, especially God's chosen city. And this new Judaism would be returning with the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which had been edited and compiled and put into a form that we would recognize during the exile. Right? We don't have the priests, we don't have the temple in exile. What we have is books. We have the books of Moses. And there would be a greater focus, of course, on prayer, everyone praying, not just, having the priests do it. And the Zadokites are going to be the guys in charge. The Zadokites were not only Levites, not only priests, but they were of high priestly descent. They were supposedly descendants of Zadok the high priest under King David. And these were the guys who became the bureaucrats, the go-betweens, the leaders, and the bookkeepers of the Persian Empire, and especially the Jewish people under the Persian Empire. They're going to be in charge in the return. Now, there's a new language. When people were off in Babylon, they learned the lingua franca of the Babylonian Empire, which was Aramaic. It's related to Hebrew, but it's not Hebrew. This is, in fact, what Jesus would commonly have spoken when he is born into this world a couple centuries later than what we're talking about here. They are, of course, Persian vassals, right? Zerubbabel, that's a Babylonian name, by the way. He may be a Jewish princeling. He may be descended from kings, but he is the governor under the emperor of Persia. There's only so far this newfound restoration will go. There's a lot of language about ending mixed marriages, and this is really because people are afraid that the Jewish people will lose their identity. Mixed marriages were not so much an issue in the past, as we've seen even King David was descended from a non-Israelite woman, but now they're trying to bring back walls of separation between the Jews and the Gentiles, right? The people of God and the people of the nations, in order to reestablish what they've lost, in order to maintain their identity. And I should point out that all the Israelites who return, they are all now adopted into one tribe, the royal tribe. Everyone is Judean. Everyone now is Jewish. Doesn't matter if you're descended from Asher or Benjamin or Simeon or what have you. Now all of God's people returning are Jews. All right, now, if you've got a Bible with you, or if you're just going to plug this into your internet search engine, let's take a quick look at the passages we'll read for our Faith 5 formation here for Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, we start off with Ezra chapter 3, verses 8 through 13. And what you have here are the people heading back to Israel, to Judea, and seeing that the foundation of a new temple has been laid. And that's it, right? The first wave got there. They laid the foundation of the temple, and then they all left because it was a lot harder to survive in a ruined country than they thought. So they had to focus on farming and building houses and starting trade and just surviving. And so these later waves of returnees come, they see the foundation, and as you can read there in Ezra chapter 3, some people are overjoyed to see the foundation of the temple, and they cheer. But those who were old enough to have seen the old temple before it was destroyed, they see this pitiful little foundation, this ridiculous beginning of work that had been abandoned, and they weep and they cry. And there's this evocative scene where the cheers of joy and the howls of sorrow mix together with this new wave of returnees under Ezra. And then you can read about Ezra's specific mission of return in the book of Ezra, chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. Okay. Jumping over then to Nehemiah. Let's look at Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. You can go ahead and Google it if you like. I like the NRSV translation. And that lays out Nehemiah's mission. As I said, he's the cupbearer under Artaxerxes II. He's leading a new wave to return, to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. To get this party started, let's get everything off the ground. Come on, guys. We're given permission to rebuild our country. By God, let's rebuild it. In Nehemiah 4, verses 1 through 15, you see that the returning Judeans face a lot of resistance from the local powers who have filled the power vacuum that was left when Israel and Judah were destroyed. Right? The poorest of the poor were left in the land, but the Ammonites and whatnot, and the Arabs, they're in the land now, and they are not eager to see the Judeans return. They don't want Jerusalem to have its walls rebuilt. They're afraid this will be nothing but trouble for them. So in Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 15, we see that there are several plots against Nehemiah, which thankfully ultimately fail. One of the things Nehemiah does is make sure that he scouts out, surveys, and rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem beginning at night so that people don't know what he's up to. One of the great enemies that Nehemiah faces is a guy named Tobiah. And Tobiah is listed as Tobiah the Ammonite in the Bible, but he is of Jewish descent, Israelite descent. He may be the governor of the Ammonites, but he's in the family, as it were. And so there's this irony of really a Judean who never left, who found power under the new order, opposing the Judeans who are returning from their 70 years in exile. And then in Nehemiah chapter 12, verses 44 through 47, we can see what I mentioned earlier, which is that really the priests are in charge. They're the leaders, they're the power brokers, they're the bureaucrats in this new arrangement that they have under the empire. That's lesson 1. Lesson 2 is the book of Esther. Now, Esther is just plain fun. It's a good story, and it is certainly thematically related to Ezra and Nehemiah because it takes place under the Persian Empire, with Judeans living in the capital city of Persia. There are, I should point out, 2 versions of the book of Esther. There's a Hebrew version and then a Greek version, which kind of expands upon the story. And depending on the Bible you have, they might have, they'll set apart the Greek parts of Esther. God's presence is implied throughout the Hebrew version of the book, but never mentioned explicitly. He is Deus absconditus, the hidden God. And so let's just tackle this story because it's a wonderful tale no matter how you cut it. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the controversy around the book of Esther. Okay? So again, if you've got your Bible or if you're Googling this in a search engine, let's look at Esther chapter 1, specifically verses 1 to 4, 10 to 12, 19 to 20, or just read the whole thing. I'd be happy with that. And what we have is what I like to call Vashti's mistake. Basically, Persian Emperor Ahasuerus, he's called in the book of Esther, generally taken to have been Xerxes, an earlier emperor than those Artaxerxes we met with Ezra and Nehemiah. Anyway, Ahasuerus summons his wife, his queen, Vashti, and she's like, no, I'm busy. And this humiliates the emperor, right? I'm supposed to be God's chosen. I'm supposed to be the ruler of the known world. And I can't even get my wife to come when I call her. And his advisors and the courtiers are like, oh, this is going to get out. Oh, man, if the wife of the emperor doesn't have to listen to him, none of our wives are ever going to listen to us. So basically, he divorces Vashti. She's out. She's not the queen anymore. And he's going to have, in effect, a beauty contest to pick a new queen. Now, keep in mind that the emperor of Persia has an entire harem of wives or half-wives, but this will be the queen, right? The counterpart, the public face of the emperor. So, in chapter 2, take a look at verses 1 through 5 and 15 through 18, and we are introduced to Esther, a young Jewish girl living in Persia, who is orphaned and adopted by Mordecai, who is a cousin of hers. And Esther ends up being sort of swept up in this dragnet that gathers the most beautiful, eligible young ladies in the kingdom. And they go through all this primping and prepping. It really is like a beauty contest. And Esther stands out for what she doesn't do, her natural beauty, right? She's not desperate to catch the king's eye, and of course that's exactly what does catch his eye. So lo and behold, lowly Esther ends up being chosen as the queen of Persia. The caveat here is that nobody knows she's Jewish, right? Esther is a derivation of Ishtar, who is a Mesopotamian goddess. Every time Easter comes around, you have people saying, "Oh, Easter's based on Ishtar." It's not at all, but the name Esther is. In chapter 2, verses 19 through 23, Mordecai, her adopted father and kinsman, saves the life of the emperor Ahasuerus. So, dang, good on you, Mordecai. But in Esther chapter 3, especially verses 1 through 10, we meet Haman, the Agagite. Haman is Grand High Muckety Muck in the Persian Empire. He also happens to be an Amalekite, which of all the peoples in the Hebrew Bible who opposed God's people Israel, the Amalekites were singled out for the most wrath, the most anger. The Amalekites were the ones that God would pursue throughout the generations to wipe them out entirely. And because of this remarkable anger shown to a relatively small people, the Amalekites in the Bible are always taken analogously or metaphorically. They represent anything within us, around us, beyond us that opposes the will of God. So whether you're Jewish or Christian, the Amalekites are no sanction of genocide. They're supposed to make us look within ourselves to see what powers in us will try to thwart God's will. But when we hear that Haman is an Agagite, Agag was an Amalekite, we're like, oh, ancient enemy, bad dude, opposed to the will of God. And basically he wants to wipe out all the Jews. Old blood feud. He convinces Ahasuerus that the Jewish people are basically fifth columnists. They have no loyalty to the Persian Empire. They have their own set of rules, their own way to eat. And boy, they can't be trusted. They're going to turn on you. We should kill them all. And the emperor's like, you make a good point. Okay, let's do that. You set a date when we're going to kill them all. We'll send a memo. Everybody will know so that we can coordinate the same day. We'll wipe them all out together. And this, of course, terrorizes the entire Jewish population of the Persian Empire. So now Esther has a mission, and we'll see that in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, 10 through 17. Esther's mission is to save the Jewish people. And this puts her at great personal risk because she hasn't let it be known that she herself is of Jewish descent. But Mordecai, her adopted father, says, look, God's going to deliver us one way or the other. He's put you in this position to save your people. And if you don't do it, God will still save us somehow. But your name and your family will not be will not be remembered in any way. God will choose another champion, another savior. So Esther, at great personal risk, she barges in on King Ahasuerus uninvited, which usually would be punishable by death. Sort of the opposite of Vashti, right? Vashti wouldn't come when she was called. Esther comes when she's not called. Anyway, Ahasuerus really likes his queen. He's like, don't worry about it. Touch the scepter. All is forgiven. And she sort of lays out this plot where she has the king, the emperor, and Haman over for dinner. And Haman thinks that she's totally into him. And she is telling the emperor, my people are all going to be murdered by, a villain who's told all these lies about us. And Ahasuerus is like, oh, that's terrible. How can I help? Long story short, the big reveal is that Esther is Jewish, that Haman not only is trying to kill her people, but he's caught in such a situation that it looks like he's trying to assault or take advantage of Esther, the queen. So the emperor is enraged, and Haman had gone and built this 70-foot tall gallows on which he was planning to hang Mordecai. Mordecai was this, wealthy, successful Persian Jew who had saved the emperor's life and was just wouldn't bow to Haman. So he was looking forward to the day when they were going to kill everybody. He was going to hang Mordecai way up there on that big old gallows. Well, Haman in chapter 7, verses 1 through 10 is hanged on his own gallows, hoisted by his own petard. The problem is that in the Persian Empire, especially according to the book of Esther, the emperor's word is law, and once he issues a decree, he can't take it back. So he's already said that the people of the empire can attack all the Jews in the empire on this given day. Well, he sends out another decree that the Jewish people can arm themselves and defend themselves and fight back against their opponents, which they do with gusto, and all the people who had tried to kill the Jews end up getting the pointy end of the stick. And then there's a big party. They call it Purim, which means, the casting of lots, because the day on which the enemies of the Jewish people were going to attack them was determined by casting lots with Haman. And it's this big celebration. To this day, Purim is a festival that involves costuming, in part because, Esther hid her identity, but also, I think, because it's about the Jewish people reasserting or refinding their identity in an alien land, in an alien empire. And there's also a tradition amongst the Orthodox that you're supposed to drink booze in celebration until you're so verschnookered that you can't tell the difference between somebody yelling, "Blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman." And when the book of Esther is read, there's these noisemakers and clackers that they spin to blot out the name of Haman whenever it comes up in the tale. It's great stuff. Is it history? There's a lot of debate as to whether Esther and Mordecai were actual people. Esther, as I mentioned, is taken from Ishtar, who is a Mesopotamian goddess, and likewise Mordecai is taken from Marduk, who was a Mesopotamian god. You may remember him from the Enuma Elish a while back. That was in Genesis. And there's debate over whether there's actually evidence for this having occurred, or even if Ahasuerus really is Xerxes, the way most people have assumed. Bottom line is we don't know. It could very well be effectively a novel about what it means to be the people of God in a foreign land with a pagan king. But one way or the other, whether it's meant to be history or whether it's meant to be a reflection on identity and the hidden purposes of God working through history, it's a fantastic story. Been made into film more than once, I believe, and is the foundation for one of the most entertaining holidays of the Old Testament. Also corresponds roughly, I believe, with the Persian Spring Festival, which didn't hurt matters. Anyway, that's Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Hopefully you enjoy the stories when you read them, and you can see how this fits into the greater narrative of the ambiguities of exile and return, and why some were not in a hurry to come on back home. Anyway, enough out of me. Go in peace, serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.